Okay. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go into media fashion and we're going to look into black entertainers. This is a subject of mine. I'm familiar with rap. I've seen drastic changes in rap music, and there is a difference between hip hop and rap and gangster rap. There is a difference between the three. My comprehension of the hip hop rap game today is image tends to hold the most precedence. I'm going to give an analogy. If you go back to rock and roll and you look at the 50s, white or black artist, you notice talent was number one. This was an era when overdubs didn't even exist. You just played it out. There were no synthesizers or digital technology being used. You just played the song. Okay. In the 1960s, image became first precedence. The image you portrayed, how you dressed, to a little degree. In the 70s, it exploded. In the 1970s, image became everything. There was great music that came out of the 60s. In the 70s, there was some good music, but image was everything. Image took hold. When the digital sound came in the 70s, late 70s primarily, it increased drastically in the 80s. In the 80s, when it comes to black music, the focus was mainly on black women. Paula Abdul, Whitney Houston. During the later part of the 80s, when rap became less underground and more mainstream, okay, now you had the 1979 Sugar Hill Gang. Okay, but in the late 80s, it was when rap broke into the mainstream. There was no longer an Afrocentric culture signature to rap music like you had seen when it was still underground in the mid 80s. Now you saw new rappers come along that were promoting a corporate image, even a violent, hostile image. Not that stuff wasn't already going on in the inner city, but the corporations use that promoting angle. So, young black men that displayed violence became mainstream. And there was a lot of talented rappers in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, even rappers at that time who were not gangster, which there was a lot. Back in the early, I'm going to take a little step further, in the early 90s, there were a lot of rappers who really weren't from the inner city or from the streets. They didn't have any gangsterism to their character. They began promoting the gangster image. You gotta remember, this is around the time films like Dangerous Minds came out with Coolio, or the film The Substitute. Later on in the 90s, you had films, films that had cooled down and they weren't as violent. In the late 90s, that started to disappear a little bit. But in the early 90s, it was very popularized. So, becoming famous, for a rapper wanting to become famous, having a gangster image became cool. One of the last groups to phase out that didn't hold that image was Kid and Play. The rappers Kid and Play. They did House Party 1 through 3. They did Class Act. And in the third House Party, in the third House Party, They showed the little group of young rappers that were in that film, in the Third House Party, where Bernie Mac was in the film. And in the Third House Party, you can see the difference between Kid and Play and these younger guys who dressed real crazy that were in the film. And so Kid and Play was a little group with, more of hip hop fun. And you can kind of see when you look at Criss Cross, you can kind of see how, I'll even show a Source magazine cover about how Kid and Play had more of an innocent look. Then you've seen Criss Cross with the braids and the jail uniform on and all that stuff. So the image changed. The image in hip hop and rap changed from one thing to the next. Now, looking into environmental psychology, you can see how your perception of people and places changes your own perception of self and changes your reaction to the world and your psychology. Okay. Social perception. I have some photographs of a famous singer named Al Green, and he went on Soul Train and he was wearing a purse. Looking at that, that was a feminization for a man to be singing on national television with a purse. I look back and I say, people today are saying how rappers wear purses and they're being feminized. Al Green was doing that on Soul Train back in the 70s. I was watching some rappers recently. You had a rapper named Lil Uzi who was wearing a dress and a purse. A dress and a purse. You've seen many other famous rappers wearing purses and dresses and becoming more feminized. Or at least, if they're not becoming more feminized, they're portraying the role. And through environmental psychology, this is changing the individual's perception who is watching this stuff. Changing them, are people going out and buying purses because these guys are buying purses? It's an interesting, is there more men wearing purses now? It's an interesting concept to look at. Very interesting concept to look at. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit to when I was talking about the image was focused on younger black males and the rap music and whatnot. Okay. The image, the promotion of fear, I feel, was a big part of that. You saw things in the news happening around that time that exhibited violence in the inner city. So rap music got into a thing where it began to promote violence. Not the rappers rapping about violence, but the portrayal in the news never stopped and said, wait a minute. The same thing he's rapping about, Arnold Schwarzenegger just did that in Terminator. Or the same thing this guy's rapping about, Sylvester Stallone just did that, in Demolition Man. Or Wesley Snipes just did that. So the rappers weren't doing anything different than what Rambo was doing. They weren't rapping about anything different. That was one of the things that I picked up in the early 90s. I thought to myself, why are people talking so bad about these rappers talking about guns when you can go to the movie theater and watch a film, watch Jean-Claude Van Damme light up 10, 15 people with a Uzi. Okay? So rappers weren't the only people speaking about violence, but rappers, I feel rap music was being pimped. How many millions of dollars were made off the portrayal of young, violent black men? These major companies made big bucks off it. You look at Boys in the Hood and Menace Society, the distribution made millions. Matter of fact, when you look at Tupac Shakur, who I break this down in my metaphysical mentoring classes, but Tupac Shakur, before he made Juice, he was an Afrocentric, relaxed guy who rapped primarily about Black Panther stuff, but it wasn't really anything violent. After Juice, he got into his whole thug life mode. Now, going into the middle of the 90s, we begin to see the East versus West. Tupac Shakur versus Biggie Smalls, and Tupac Shakur, Biggie Smalls, opened for Tupac in some of his shows at one time. Tupac Shakur Biggie opened for Tupac. So why was there this feud between them? You had an East versus West type of scenario going on. Was it because it sold more records? Why did that take? Why? Because I don't think these two people. When I look back at the rap game, and I look back at Tupac Shakur, they were in the process of creating a Death Row East Coast, and he was working with East Coast rappers. I get the feeling that him and Biggie Smalls weren't really having as much issues as what was portrayed. So that's something I was looking at. So anyhow, going back to music, now another thing that happened in the early 90s, there was a movie, and I don't know why I'm interjecting this right now, but there was a film called Lean On Me about, and the funny thing is one of the hall monitors in the film ended up playing Candyman. Tony Todd was a hall monitor in the film Lean On Me, and he went on to star as Candyman in the film Candyman. But Lean On Me was a true story. Lean On Me was a true story based in New Jersey with a principal at a high school named Mr. Clark. And Mr. Clark had put chains and locks on all the doors to keep the students out that weren't for the right thing, to keep the dope peddlers out. And he was harsh, but he got the grades up high in the school. And he got the young people to pay attention. And they criticized him and ridiculed him so bad. Matter of fact, the head of education at that time, I think during the Clinton around the time of the Clinton administration, during the Clinton administration, was a man named Anthony J. Bennett. He wrote a book. He was a Yale graduate. He wrote a book called Devaluing America, where he went in to the poor education in America and how students were dropping out of school and getting on drugs. In his book, he talked about Mr. Clark, and Mr. Clark was successful in keeping these children safe, and he was successful at raising their scores on their test, raising their book scores. They were getting good marks. Children who got D's were now getting A's. And the way they ridiculed him was terrible. They ridiculed him so terrible. And okay, so now this short lecture, I'm gonna get back to where I originally started off. We were talking about Soul Train. Some of the rappers wearing purses and whatnot. why is there so, people are taking these celebrities and they're being used as billboards. They're being used as billboards to promote sexual symbolism, possibly even promote perversion. I even said it gets off into the spiritual realm of, I came up with a short lecture about what are you channeling, and that's in some of my metaphysical mentoring work. But basically, this is a form of channeling, looking at these characters and studying these characters, and younger people absorb the information by watching them. And so I just wanted to make a little, this is a little commentary I was making, a follow-up on that. Okay.